The killing of babies, infanticide, is of such a nature not to give the slightest inquietude to the most timid of imaginations, for once you are old enough to be threatened by it, you are too old for it to be a problem. Hello. The words that you just heard me say were, you may be pleased to know, not my own, but those of Jeremy Bentham, the great philosopher and social reformer of the early 19th century. And we need to unpack why he said them to make sense of what his ideas are all about. Jeremy Bentham lived at a time when Britain's industrial poor were living in absolute abject poverty. It was the very height of the Industrial Revolution, and to work in Britain's inner cities was to have a most appalling life possible. The result was that when people had children, there was often very little money to accommodate or look after them. So what do you do in that situation? Well, of course, for some people, the actual killing of an unwanted infant might be a solution. But here's the problem. The problem is, of course, that when working class women were caught killing their children, they faced the death penalty. And Jeremy Bentham felt this was fundamentally wrong, because he felt that any rule about behaviour was a rule that was put forward by those in charge or those with power. So, for example, it might be the church trying to control people's behaviour, or it might be the government trying to control people's behaviour. And even now, in 2023, you still get situations where people will appear on media or social media saying you should do this or you shouldn't do that. But of course, says Bentham, what they're actually doing is they're projecting their own values and ideas, which are often not the values and ideas of ordinary working people. So he felt very much that there should be no rules about behaviour. The actual idea about whether you should or should not kill someone shouldn't be anything to do with a prima facie rule that actually already exists. Instead, says Bentham, what you need to do is you need to ask yourself one fundamental question. How happy would the action make you, and how much suffering would the action bring if you did or didn't do it? And we call this the principle of utility. The actual idea that there are no rights or wrongs, there are just consequences of our actions, and our job as thinking and caring human beings is to weigh up what those consequences might be and what effect they could have on ourselves, those we love, and those around us. So our challenge in today's presentation is whether the principle of utility, doing the thing that brings the greatest pleasure or benefit to the greatest number of people, to the greatest extent, is actually a valid approach. There are plenty of people that would criticize this utilitarian idea. They would say, oh, this is a recipe for allowing the most appalling injustice. For example, there's nothing within that would say you shouldn't allow people to have slaves. If the majority of people would benefit from having a slave, then actually the slave is their value is of less importance than the majority's value. And to a certain extent, that's a fair criticism. And later utilitarians took that on board and tried to shape and adjust the ideas to reflect the dangers of a purely numbers-based approach to whether things were right or wrong. However, and this is the valid point that Bentham makes very strongly, and why, not that I commend infanticide to you, I'll come back to that, but the point is that any value you put on things, any rule you put on things, comes from your own background and ideas. Bentham recognised this when he talks about rights, for example. Rights he calls nonsense upon stilts. The actual idea that I can determine what rights you should or should not be entitled to have. One final thing, let me bring it back to the infanticide. The reason why we allow abortion in this country is not because abortion's right, it's just that the benefit of not having abortion allowed is much worse than the detriment of permitting it. Backstreet abortionists, people with unwanted pregnancies, that is fundamentally a bad thing. But to actually kill children might also be seen as a bad thing, but is it a worse thing? And Bentham's point is a very straightforward one. An infant is not going to be bothered one way or the other because they're not capable of understanding right, wrong, death, not death. And therefore, infanticide is an acceptable option if it brings a greater benefit to that family. I'm not advocating that. In our day, our values have changed. But nonetheless, he makes a valid point. Think about what Bentham had to say. I'll develop the ideas of utilitarians in other presentations. Take care, like the video, subscribe to the channel, recommend it to your friends. Have a good day.